Dr. Jason Lisle is a Christian astrophysicist who researches issues pertaining to science and the Christian faith. He double majored in physics and astronomy with a minor in mathematics at the Ohio Wesleyan University. He then went on to obtain a master's degree and a Ph.D. in astrophysics at the University of Colorado in Boulder. His postgraduate research concentrated on solar dynamics, utilizing NASA's Solar and Heliospheric Observatory to monitor the surface of the Sun. His dissertation probing the dynamics of solar supergranulation and its interaction with magnetism is available from the University of Colorado, and he has published numerous papers in the scientific journals concerning convection cells in the Sun. Dr. Lisle, it is a huge honor, and let me welcome you to the KKT Show podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it really is, and I'm really hoping to have a really fun discussion with you about all sorts of things, but mainly evolution and presuppositional apologetics. So maybe we'll get into it. And so before we begin, maybe I'll ask you just one thing. So how would you define evolution? How would you define evolution? Maybe we'll start with that, and how does the wider scientific community define?
Okay, well, I mean, the word can be used a number of ways. It just generically, it means change, and we all agree things change, so we all agree in that type of evolution. But usually, at least here in the United States, usually when people refer to the word evolution, they're referring to a specific idea that all life is descended from a common ancestor, that life began as chemicals came together and formed the first cell, and then that cell, as it reproduced, and split into other cells, mutations occurred, and you get changes, and so that it became different over the course of time. It became all the other life forms that we see on Earth. So common ancestry, sometimes called the neo-Darwinian evolution, the idea that mutations in natural selection eventually have caused something like bacteria to eventually become everything else as it reproduced. So that's the way I'm using the term evolution, is in the sense of common descent or neo-Darwinian evolution.
Right, yeah. So I've heard multiple ways, because I've heard some people talk about neo-Darwinian evolution, and some refer to something called structural evolution, which I think in reference to theistic evolution. But we leave that aside for a moment. We'll still, so this is the basic idea behind evolution, and it seems to me that there is evolution observed in the microevolutionary sense, which is that so there does seem to be changes in the morphological structure based on outside environment. So the peppered moths might be an example of that. But then so I was reading up on it, and apparently they also use Darwin's finches as an example of speciation. Now, is that right? And also, has there ever been an example of speciation observed, which would really give an oomph to the proponents of neo-Darwinian evolution?
Okay, several things there. So sometimes people will use the term microevolution to refer to the kind of changes that we observe happening, where you get different breeds of dog, for example. Well, we know how to do that. You can take two dogs that have a lot of what we call heterozygosity, where they have a lot of differences in their DNA, and by selectively inbreeding them, you can get different breeds of dog, but they're still dogs. Some people call that microevolution. I call that variation within a kind. And we observe that. And so that's all good. God apparently gave animals the ability to diversify within a certain extent. And so offspring are not identical to their parents. They are a lot like their parents. They're the same kind, but they have little differences, and those can accumulate over time. And so you can get different breeds. Then there's the question of speciation. Can you get different species? I would argue that yes, you can. And that surprises people, because they think that creation scientists like myself don't believe in speciation. But in fact, we do. Species, that's kind of a modern man-made classification system. And it refers to kind of the lowest or highest, depending on how you put it, level of differentiation. And so there, you can talk about different species of dogs. But we think that all dogs are the same kind, but there are, depending on who you ask, there can be different species of dogs. But we think they're all descended from two dogs that got off Noah's Ark. There are different species of cats, but we think there's only one cat kind. So we think that Noah had two cats on Noah's Ark, and modern cats, all modern cats, whether they're lions or tigers or little house cats, we think those are all descended from two cats that were on Noah's Ark. but they'd be classified as different species. And so that would be an example of speciation. Now, I don't know if Darwin's finches are classified as different species. I'm not sure about that. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But my point is, we do allow for that, and that's something that that we would expect based on the way God is created and the diversity that He has built into organisms to produce variations within a kind. We would expect that as creationists. But my point is, cats are still cats, dogs are still dogs, finches are still finches, and so they remain the same kind. It's just that in some cases we classify them as a new species. And usually we classify them as a species if they don't normally interbreed with other species and produce fertile offspring. They're usually classified as a different species. So horses and donkeys are the same kind, but they're different species because they don't normally interbreed and produce fertile offspring.
Right. Right. So maybe I can ask you about so we use the word kind, right? And I've heard it, in the Bible. It is there in the Bible. No one seems to use it in the in the outside world, especially when they talk about evolution. So when you say kinds and species, are you making a difference there? Can I maybe ask you to expand on that a
Yeah.
bit more?
Yeah. So yeah, we would define kind as different from species. Kind, the biblical kind, and the reason we use that word is it's the word the Bible uses, or it's the English translation of the Hebrew word bara min, created kind. And so it's basically a kind. Two organisms are the same kind if they are genuinely descended from a common ancestor, if they are related to each other biologically. And so by that definition, the reason evolutionists don't use that is because in their view, all organisms are descended from a common ancestor. So there's only one kind in the evolutionary view. That's why they don't use that term. But we creationists do. We find it very useful because we would say dogs are a different kind from cats. Dogs and cats are not related to each other. But all dogs are related to all other dogs, so they're all the same kind. Humans are all the same kind, human beings, even though we have different ethnicities, things like that. Depending on who you ask, there are at least different species of humans, if you want to classify Neanderthals as a different species, but they're still humans. They're the same kind. They're descended from Adam and Eve. So that's how we would define kind. And the way we would scientifically then discuss whether two organisms are the same kind, if they can interbreed at all and produce offspring, they're the same kind. And we know that biblically because God created organisms according to their kinds and told them to go and multiply. And apparently they multiply according to their kinds because God brought two of each kind on board Noah's Ark. And so that tells us the kind is the reproductive limit of an organism. So if two animals can interbreed, they're the same kind. The tricky part is there's not a negative criterion. If two animals can't interbreed, that doesn't prove they're different kinds, because there's some species of dogs that can't interbreed anymore, and so they're classified as different species, but they're still the same kind. So the tricky part is scientifically to prove a negative, to prove that they're different kinds, but we can prove they're the same kind if they can interbreed at all. Whereas species is a little more specific. Species means they can still interbreed today and produce fertile offspring, and they normally do so. So it's a different term than kind.
Right. Okay. Yeah. This actually helps. So okay. So this is how people who are creationists talk about kinds. Okay. Yeah. That kind of helps me understand that a bit. So in that case, we don't. From a creationist point of view, do we believe in common descent in any meaningful fashion, or is it
Well,
purely the
not in the sense that I don't believe that humans and apes have a common ancestor. We are different kinds. And the reason for that comes from the fact that God was kind enough to record us some of the details of his creation in Genesis. And God created animals according to their kinds. So I don't believe in common descent in that sense. I do believe that all cats have a common ancestor. So
right?
they share a common ancestor.
The
And all
same
dogs share
kind,
a common ancestor. Yeah, they're
the
the
same
same kind.
kind. Right.
But I don't believe that different kinds share a common ancestor. That's where I differ with my evolutionist friends.
Right. So I guess this is where I guess maybe I can ask you, how then do we talk about the similarities between, say, the high percentage of shared DNA between the humans and the chimpanzees, if not through common ancestry? What do we attribute that kind of similarity to? Which,
Okay,
yeah, can I ask you
that's a
that?
good question. Yeah, that's a good question. A couple things. First of all, the similarity is not as much as evolutionists sometimes claim. I've heard claims that, well, we're 97% similar. Some of them said we're 99% similar genetically. Well, the chimpanzee genome it's like 4% longer than the human genome. So even if the rest of it was identical, you'd have at least 4% difference. So that can't be right. It's closer to 80%, and it depends on how you count it. But there are similarities, and I would expect that because genes determine traits. I mean, the reason I have two eyes and a nose and ears is because I've got genes to produce two eyes, a nose, and ears. And guess what? Apes do too, because they have two eyes, they have a nose, and they have ears. Their anatomy is similar, and it's got differences too, but it's got similarities to human anatomy in terms of hands and, five fingers and opposable thumb and so on. And so we have similar features, and DNA is what determines our features. DNA is the instructions to make our anatomy. And so it makes sense that if two organisms have similar anatomy, they would have to have similar instructions to produce that anatomy, regardless of how they got those instructions. And so you see, creationists would also expect that organisms that have the most similarities would have the most similar DNA, because the DNA is what produces those similarities. And so when evolutionists say, oh, well, that proves common descent, they're committing a logical fallacy called the confirmation bias. And that's where you say, my theory predicts this, and we see that, therefore my theory is true, when in fact the alternative theory would also predict exactly the same thing. Creationists would also expect organisms with similar DNA to have similar traits, and vice versa, because DNA codes for traits. So when someone asks, why is it that organisms that have most similar physical traits have similar DNA, I'd say, well, it has to be that way. All that proves is that DNA codes for traits.
Right. Okay, yeah. Why then do comparative genomics, they say that it's approximately 99% shared DNA? What are they talking about then when they claim that with such, conviction?
Yeah. You see, the problem is there's different ways of measuring similarity in DNA. There's different ways of doing it. And they tend to do it in a way that gives them an answer that's favorable to their position. And I'm not accusing them of intentional fraud. It's just we tend to find what we look for. And so what they'll do is they'll find sections that are already similar and compare those sections. And then they tend not to look at the sections that are not so similar. The person who really is the expert on this, who could go into all the details, is Dr. Jeff Tompkins. And I worked with Dr. Jeff Tompkins for years, and he's the one that gave me the 80% figure. He said to me that it's closer to 80% is the true similarity. But keep in mind, there's only 4 base pairs, right? In terms of the nuclear structures, there's the 4 nuclei, A, G, C, and T. And so even if there was no similarity at all, if you took a complete random sequence and lined it up with another random sequence, you'd have 25% similarity, because there's only 4 possible combinations.
Well, yeah, that is true.
Statistically, you'd expect 25% similarity. So there's already going to be some similarity there to begin with. And if you take the sections that are most similar and line them up in the right way, humans and chimpanzees don't even have the same number of chromosomes. And so they take 2 of the chromosomes and attach them together, and we say, we think this is the same as this one, and so on. So it depends on how they line it up. That's where they're getting those higher numbers, but it doesn't come from actually analyzing the true comparison between the 2 sets, as Dr. Jeff Tompkins has done. That's where he gets the 80% number.
Oh, okay. Is the research on his work available? I mean, I was just
It is.
Maybe I could.
It's peer reviewed. It's published in peer reviewed literature. I think it's available in the Answers Research Journal, either that or the Creation Research Society Quarterly, and those are cool. Both peer reviewed journals. So yeah,
I'll look into it. Okay, so it's not exactly 98%, but what we get is 80%, and that is evidence of maybe a common designer as opposed to a common descent. Is
common designer, and common functionality. God made the hands on the apes similar to ours so they could grasp. And so the instructions to produce those hands are very similar, but there are a lot of differences too. And that's one of the things that makes us very different.
Right. So then I guess what that sort of moves us to is this. So, but there are similarities in the non-functional. It's nested hierarchies, and you've got similarities in non-functional areas as well, right? Because I've heard a lot of some of my colleagues and others also claim that there is a similarity in non-functional areas. Now, okay, you'd expect similarities in the functional areas for a common designer, but if it's non-functional similarity, then you'd have to assume, either God was arbitrary about that, or then common descent. And that seemed, well, at least I don't know enough to debunk any of that, but that seemed, at least on the face of it, well logical enough.
Okay. Yeah, so the issue there, first of all, we don't know that they're non-functional. It's just that some of them are non-coding. They're non-coding. They don't produce proteins, but
Oh
that doesn't mean
yeah.
they're non-functional. Some of these genes, for example, some of these genes that are called introns, they look like genes, but they don't produce proteins normally. But there have been some cases where when a healthy gene is damaged, the intron, which normally does not code, will kick in and it will start coding. So some of these are backups for when genes become non-functional. It's really kind of amazing. Some of them might be structural. I mean, there are these long chains of telomeres that occur at the end of chromosomes, and those maybe keep them from unraveling. They kind of keep them together. So they still have a purpose. And in some cases, we got to be careful about this. Just because we don't know what something does doesn't mean it has no function. It just means we haven't discovered that function yet. I mean, I've got fire alarms. I've got a sprinkler system in my apartment here. It's never gone off, but that doesn't mean that it's useless. It's just I've never had a fire in this apartment, and so those have never kicked in. There are things like that in the genome that we may not know what function they have because they only kick in under certain circumstances, or they're structural. There's a lot about the genome that we still don't understand, and so just because something doesn't code for traits, doesn't code for proteins, pardon me, doesn't mean it has no purpose. And so there are still reasons for these things, and we got to be careful about saying, I don't know what this does, therefore it's a useless leftover of evolution. You don't know that. You just haven't discovered its purpose yet.
Oh, I hadn't thought. Okay, so some of them might act as backup.
Mm-hmm. That's known. We know that some introns act as backups when a functional gene is damaged.
Could you go into that a bit more so that I can sort of wrap my head around it? I'd love to, because it seems really, I had not thought of that. I'd not considered that. I'd not known that, but it is, I
Yeah.
did not, yeah. Can you maybe go
Well,
a bit more about it? As much as,
I can't
you
give
want to.
I can't give you too much detail because I'm not a geneticist, but my
No,
friends,
yeah,
like I've
that's,
got friends like Dr. Georgia Purdom, and she's an expert in genetics, molecular genetics. Jeff Tompkins, I already mentioned, and they've told me some of these amazing things about DNA. Certain things that are called introns that they're normally not transcribed into proteins, but when healthy genes are destroyed or damaged, these introns kick in and will start producing proteins. I don't know how often that occurs. I don't know what the ratio is, but I know that's been discovered. And the other thing is some structures in DNA may be there for structural support rather than for coding genes. There's a lot of sections in DNA that don't, as far as we know, don't code for proteins. And sometimes those are called junk DNA, but we now know that a lot of that has a purpose. We just didn't know what it was previously, and we're discovering more and more that there's purpose for this so-called junk DNA. So you got to be careful. Just because we don't know what something does doesn't mean it's useless. They used to say, decades ago, they used to argue that the appendix doesn't do anything. It's a useless leftover of evolution. Well, we now know that's wrong. The appendix is part of the immune system, and it helps fight bacteria, and it keeps them from going up, your colon up into your intestines and making you sick and so on. So it does have a purpose. You can live without it, but that doesn't mean it has no purpose. You can live without your left arm, but that doesn't mean your left arm is useless, right? So a lot of these structures that they used to say are useless, we now know have a purpose. And we're discovering the same kind of thing now in genetics. We're finding sections of DNA that we thought, well, these don't produce proteins, therefore they're useless. No, they do have a function. It's just we didn't know what it was previously.
oh, okay, that's fascinating because you hear about vestigial organs and why they exist even in the first place, so which is again an argument against a common designer. But I guess the answer about appendix is also interesting. I had not. Okay, so the vestigial organs aren't actually vestigial in the way that they claim, but apparently they do serve functions that we had not previously
do.
known.
Right.
Oh,
They used to argue the tailbone was useless for back
yeah,
when we had
yeah.
tails, but it's actually an important point of muscle attachment. And when people break their tailbone, they find they can't sit comfortably, they can't climb stairs easily anymore because that point of muscle attachment has been damaged. And so it does serve a purpose. A lot of these, they used to say your pituitary gland, your thyroid gland, they used to think those were useless. Well, those you need those to live. They just didn't know what they did. They didn't realize that they produced important chemicals that you need to be alive. So a lot of the stuff, there were, I think, just like a century ago, there were over 130 organs that they classified as vestigial, and we now know they all have a purpose. Some of them you can live without. You can live without your gallbladder, but it does help you. It helps digest certain foods, especially foods that have a lot of grease in them. Your gallbladder will kick in and help you. You can live without it, but you find it harder to
Yeah.
eat pizza without it. So all these things do have a purpose.
Oh, that's so well. That's just because but the funny thing about that is because they claim that a creationist almost always say, well, this is God's doing, or if something isn't known, well, that points to God or something. But apparently over here, what's happening is that they didn't know what the use of it was, and just claimed therefore that they were non-functional. But now we know that they're functional, and which actually deals a blow to their preconceptions, which is fascinating. I had not.
Yep.
Okay, so the vestigial argument, which organ argument, is not actually a very concrete one now, is it? Because apparently I thought it was.
Yeah,
Oh,
even 100 years ago, they were still using that, and now almost all those organs that they thought were useless, some of them we know are essential now, and some of them we know, well, you can live without it, but it's still nice to have it.
right, yeah, no, yeah, this makes this makes a lot of sense. So maybe I can ask you about this then. So this is something that I read about some, and I wanted to ask you a question on it. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not an expert in this at all, but apparently we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and the chimpanzees have 24. So apparently, what happened, or at least what they claim happened, is that there was a fusion that occurred, and then there is this paper by Y Fan, if I'm not mistaken, in 2002, which claims genomic structure and evolution of the ancestral chromosome fusion site in 2q13 and 2q14 that supports the prediction that a chromosome fusion occurred in humans. Now, I've heard that this is actually a pretty strong claim against young Earth creationism, because this shows that that we did share the same, and apparently this fusion occurred, and so this fusion site contains again vestigial telomeres and a second centromere, so it is consistent with the fusion of two ancestral ape chromosomes, supporting the common and shared ancestry with other apes. That's what I've heard, and try to understand from what I've read. Is that a strong argument against it? And can you maybe explain it a bit more? Because as far as I understand it, okay, there was fusion, but apart from that, I don't really get much of it.
You explained it well. Yeah. So basically, the chimpanzees have 24 chromosomes, and so the idea is at one point, one of our ancestors had these 24 chromosomes because we're supposedly related to chimpanzees. And so two of those chromosomes fused together and form what I think is our chromosome number 2, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 2 days.
And so,
Yeah, 2 days.
yeah. And so it's it's formed just a single longer one, and that's why we have 23 allegedly. And that sounds really nice. And there are there's evidence of what are telomeres normally occur at the end of chromosomes, and they're just repeated sequences of, like, I think it's AT or something like that. They're just repeated sequences. They don't code for proteins.
Right.
And
at the end of that thing, right? At the end of that.
Yeah, and there's normally thousands of them. Yeah, there's normally thousands of them at the end of chromosome. And so you'd expect if these two had touched together, there'd be thousands of these, but there's not. There's maybe a couple hundred, something like that. So if it had really been two chromosomes that had fused, you'd expect thousands of these telomeres, and instead you find a few hundred. And it's not at the fusion site, the place where the two chromosomes would have to touch. That's not where it occurs. And in fact, Dr. Jeff Tompkins discovered that the actual supposed fusion site is in the middle of a functional gene. It's a gene that actually codes for a protein. And so that makes no sense. If you
that won't work, right? Oh, okay.
Yeah, because you'd expect it to be the fusion site would be where the telomeres come together, and there'd be thousands of them. But instead, there's just a few hundred, and the actual fusion site is not there. It's over here in the middle of a functional gene. And so that really argues against their view. But again, that's something that Dr. Jeff Tompkins has published. If you take a look at Tompkins' research on the alleged chromosome 2 fusion site, you can get a little more detail on that than I can go into.
No, yeah, but oh, that's actually helpful. So you'd expect way more than what we see observe right now.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah. I had not know. Okay, so that's not as strong an argument as they claim it to be, because I've heard a lot of people say that, well, this is the death blow to YEC, because
Yeah.
look at these papers, and again, not just as one paper, but they say there are multiple papers that sort of get into this, and then they show the figures of how well that fusion occurs, and therefore it's almost beyond doubt that this occurred, and which shows our common ancestry with the great apes.
Until you
Wow.
look at the details and you realize it's not where it's supposed to be. So yeah, so it doesn't work out as nice as they think it does.
Right. Yeah. Now, so I guess so there, this I guess this is the way in which, well, there's a lot of claims like this out there, and especially among educated folk on this, which to be honest, to someone who's a novice or doesn't really understand much of the field, apart from the bare bones of the basic idea, when you hear about it, you go, well, I've got no answer to that. I'm just stumped, because well, if there's a paper that actually shows that there was a fusion that occurred and shows our descent from the great apes, well, maybe that's true, because we all read papers and for our own disciplines, but well, then this might be true. So I guess that sort of leads me to this idea of the fact that we need experts, right? Because of course, there it is true that I think it was Dr. Joe Boot who wrote The Cult of the Expert. I'm not sure, but I think it was one of the guys that I follow on Twitter, and yeah, it is true. A lot of these so-called experts seem to lead us to a lot of, but still, we do rely on them, right? I mean, doctors, we rely on doctors. We do rely on good engineers. We do rely on experts for a lot of things. So people like you with a PhD. So, and especially when we're not well versed in that subject, in a particular subject, shouldn't we just have to rely on them and to know from them? So what do we do? Because, like, for instance, this example, there's no way that, unless I had asked you or someone else, like you mentioned, Dr. Jeff Tompkins, that I would have known, okay, so there's an issue there. There's no way I would have known that. So how does one,
Mhm.
because we do have to trust them at some point, but
Mhm.
also there's this question of how far do I trust you?
Yeah, and that's a tricky question to answer because I rely on experts too. I'm not an expert in genetics, but I have friends who are, and I rely on their expertise. There's just a few things I like to keep in mind. First of all, what is the worldview of this expert, and how might that affect his or her interpretation of the evidence? And so, if somebody is a staunch atheist, it doesn't matter what evidence they find of God; they're going to interpret that to be consistent with their atheism, and they're not necessarily trying to be dishonest or anything. It's just automatic. That's just what we do. And so when I listening to, let's say, an atheist who's a biologist, I would trust what he would say about his observations. He says, I look through the microscope, I see this, that, and the other. I say, I tend to believe you. I don't think you're lying. And he says, and here's how I think these came to be. Well, now wait a minute. Now you're speculating on the past, and your worldview is wrong when it comes to the past because you're an atheist, and so you don't have the true origins of the universe. And so now I'm going to have my guard up. I'm going to be a little more skeptical about the conclusions that you draw. So I tend to accept what both creationist scientists and atheistic scientists or secular scientists say about what they observed, but I'm a little more cautious when they start telling me what it means, because what it means to them will depend on their way of thinking, their worldview. And so that's one thing that I look at. Another thing you got to be careful of is experts who make claims that it's outside their area of expertise. And so if somebody is a chiropractor and he's telling me about some new discovery in outer space, okay, but I'd love to hear it. I'd rather hear it from an astronomer. I'd rather hear it from somebody who is an expert on outer space. So that's another thing we got to be careful about. And then I would remind my Christian brothers and sisters that when people start speculating on what happened in the distant past, millions of years ago, none of them were there. None of them are experts on that. And so a person can be an expert on biology and know about how the body works today. That doesn't qualify him to tell you what happened allegedly millions of years ago, because he wasn't around. He's an expert on the way the body works today. And you should have some degree of confidence in when he says something about how the body works today. But when he speculates on how it came to be that way, his expertise really qualify him to make that statement. So that's something to keep in mind. Keep in mind a person's worldview, what their area of expertise is, and then always, I as a Christian would say we should always judge things ultimately by God's word, because God is the ultimate expert on everything. And so when God has written something that's in the Bible, that's true. And when somebody says something that's contrary to that, I don't care how smart that person is, they're not as smart as God. They're nowhere near God's level of intelligence. And so I would say, I'm going to stick with what the Bible says. And I would encourage other people to do that as well. So those are some little things that I keep in mind when I'm listening to an expert. But I do think that we should consider expert testimony. We need to take it with a grain of salt, as they say. We need to be a little bit cautious about it.
Right. Yeah. So when you say worldview, I guess you refer to the presuppositions that are sort of baked into what it is that they believe in the first place, right?
Yeah.
I guess can I ask you a bit more on that, because it might help clarify a bit. So if we have say an atheist scientist who claims apparently that the Earth was billions and millions of years ago, the universe was billions of years ago. And he uses a lot of techniques. We might get into some of them, but so he does that. But it is in his field of expertise. Let's say he's an astronomer. He's a geologist. Let's say so he does understand these things in meticulous detail. So when someone of that caliber and with that expertise in that field talks about that and claims this long age of the Earth. Do we then talk about his worldview? Do we then think, oh no, but he has different presuppositions than mine, which are not Christian, which are atheistic in nature, and therefore that has led him to that kind of a conclusion, which others would not? Can you maybe expand on that a bit?
Yeah. Let's consider somebody who is, let's say, a geophysicist. So he knows all about the physics of Earth, rocks, things like that, how
Right.
rocks form. Maybe he's studied volcanoes. Maybe he's seen rocks that have come out of volcano and have hardened, and he's examined them and knows what they look like and so on. That qualifies him to tell me a lot about rocks today. It really doesn't qualify him to tell me what happened millions of years ago. Now, he might say, oh, but rocks that come out of volcanoes look like this, and this rock looks like that, so it probably came out of a volcano. I might accept that. That seems pretty reasonable. But if he says that, and I think it came out of a volcano a million years ago, well, how do you know that? Now, if he's got a degree in physics as well, if he's a geophysicist, he might say radiometric dating. We can measure the rates of radioactive elements. Now, this is something I know a good bit about. This is something that
I want to ask you about that, but yeah, go
yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So with radiometric dating, it's a way of trying to estimate the age of a rock since it hardened. It only works on igneous type rocks that were once magma, that were liquid, and they've hardened, and that's supposed to set the 0 point of the clock. And there are certain elements in rocks that are radioactive or unstable, and that refers to elements that will spontaneously change into another element, like uranium-238. Uranium-238 is unstable. It will decay into another atom, which is also unstable. It will decay into another atom and another one, all the way down to lead-206. And lead-206 is stable. So once it reaches lead-206, it'll stay lead-206 forever. And most atoms are stable, so they don't change. But a small fraction of them are radioactive. And the rate at which this happens today is very, very consistent. It doesn't depend on temperature very much. It doesn't depend on chemistry. And so we know the rate at which the uranium changes into lead, or the rate at which potassium decays into argon, radioactive potassium decays into argon, and so on. And we can measure these things. And so we say, okay, well, assuming there was no lead in the rock to begin with, how long would it take at today's rates for that uranium to decay into that lead? And we can do the math. I've done the math on this, and you get millions of years. And you say, well, there you go. The rock's millions of years old. Not so fast. You've made some assumptions. How do you know that there was no lead in the rock to begin with? You see, you're assuming that all the lead came from decay of uranium. And by the way, evolutionists and other secular scientists do not assume that there was no lead in the rock to begin with. They assume that there was some there to begin with. But how much should you start with? Well, if you tell me how old you want the rock to be, I'll tell you how much lead it started with, you see. And so you can actually work it backwards. You can say, if you want this rock to be 100 years old, I can tell you how much lead it started with. If you want it to be 1,000,000 years old, I can tell you it started with less lead, and so on. And likewise with uranium, it's even easier with potassium and argon, because that's a one-step process. Uranium to lead is
I'm sorry to
multiple
interrupt,
steps.
but that
Go
sort of
ahead.
sounds like you manipulate the data to fit the regression line instead of you sort of manipulate it. So you've got data points, but you cramp them up the way you want them to, so that you can. Well, that sounds ridiculous. I didn't. Wait,
Yeah,
so
there's a
they.
degree of circularity. Yeah. Now, and by the way, secularists would say, oh, but we've got ways to estimate the initial
Yeah,
parent
I've
to daughter
heard.
elements.
Yeah, I've heard them claim that they've observed the rate of radioactive decay to be a constant. Studies by
Mhm.
the International Atomic Energy Agency and I guess the others also have
Mhm.
claimed that this is constant, that they've laboratory experimentations and, of course, quantum mechanical formulas that sort of show in, excuse me, great detail that this is in fact constant. Now, I but not consider, but can you maybe expound it? So they
Yeah.
claim with certainty that it is.
So yeah, and that was what I was taught when I went through school. I was taught radioactive decay happens at a no. I mean, it's different for different elements, right? Some elements decay faster than others.
Right, right.
But I was taught there's nothing you can do to change the radioactive decay rate. We now know that's wrong. We now know that's wrong. We know that there are certain kinds of radioactive decay that can be sped up. For example, the rhenium-osmium reaction. In a laboratory, we can speed it up by a factor of 1,000,000,000. All you have to do is strip away the electrons from the rhenium, and it will decay 1,000,000,000 times faster from rhenium into osmium. And granted, that's just one example. But my point is that assumption, that's something that was drilled into me when I was young, is you can't change the rate of radioactive decay. We now know with certain elements you can, and it's an enormous amount. So this idea that you can't change it at all, we now know is false, because we've demonstrated that, at least in one case in a laboratory, that it's false. And some people say, oh, but that's just one example. And I would say, yes, but all it takes is one example to prove that that's false, that the assumption that they're always constant is false. We now know that's wrong. And in fact, there's good evidence that the rate of radioactive decay was faster in the past. So that's something else you have to keep in mind. There's one of these secular assumptions is the assumption of uniformitarianism.
Yeah,
And
I've heard you talk about that.
uniformitarianism is the belief that rates and conditions today are kind of like rates and conditions in the past. And so if radioactive decay happens slowly today, it always happens slowly. But that's not a scientific conclusion. That's an assumption. That's a philosophical assumption that secularists make, one that I would reject. I think there's good evidence that radioactive decay rates were much faster in the past. And we can talk about that if you like. But my point is, all these dating techniques make assumptions. And with radiometric dating, there are at least three. One is that you know the initial ratio of parent to daughter element. So if you have a rock that's got some potassium and some argon in it, the assumption is that it was all potassium to begin with, because argon's a gas, and when it was a liquid, it could have leaked through the rock. And that sounds pretty reasonable, except we know there are instances where that doesn't happen, where the argon remains in there, and some of the argon's original. That's going to mess up your
So
estimate.
it starts up
There-
with a quantity of argon to begin with.
yeah, yeah.
Right,
There's
right,
some,
right.
there are some instances where we know that's happened, because there's certain rocks where we've used the rocks that are brand new. We saw them come out of the volcano. And we sent them into secular labs, so we couldn't be accused of bias, and asked them to get the age estimate. And they come back with ages of hundreds of thousands of years on rocks that we know are brand new. And so that tells us the method's flawed. It doesn't tell us how it's flawed. It just tells us that it doesn't work, because it's giving the wrong answer on rocks whose age we know. But in some cases, it's the potassium argon method. And they'll say, oh, we know why it gave the wrong answer. There was excess argon in the rock when it formed, because normally the potassium argon method is called a model age method, and that's where they assume that there's no daughter product, because the daughter product is a gas, and when it's magma, it should just just bubble through the gas. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's enough of it, it stays there, and when you age date the rock, you get an age that's much older than the true age. And so they say that's why these are giving wrong ages. And I'll say, okay, I believe you. But how do you know that didn't happen with these other rocks that you believe are genuinely millions of years old? How do you know that there wasn't excess argon in those as well? And they don't know that. So that's an
Okay.
assumption, the assumption of the initial ratio of elements. the assumption that the decay rates are constant, and the assumption that the parent and daughter elements have remained trapped in the rock. And it's, in some cases, uranium can actually move in and out of rocks under certain circumstances. So we know that's wrong too. But anyway, the point is that these are uniformitarian assumptions that I would reject.
Right. Can I just ask you on that a bit more, just my own sake? And please correct me if I'm wrong, but we've got the cases where the rocks have argon, or some cases where the rocks have argon initially to begin with, and therefore that skews up the dates enormously.
Yes.
But is it still not a reasonable assumption to make that they wouldn't have argon to begin with, and it's just the exception that there were some rocks that had them initially? Or is that
well, you'd think so, except we know of a number of cases where that's not true, because there are rocks that we know their true age because we saw them form. Their true age is 0. And then you send them into the lab and you get ages of hundreds of thousands of years. Now, that doesn't always happen, but it happens often enough that you can't rely on the method because you don't know if you're going to get an accurate age or one that's wildly inflated. And so
Right.
for me, that's enough to say this method is not a reliable method. That's not to say it always gives the wrong answer, but it often does. And therefore you can't rely on this as an indicator of the actual age of the rock.
Right. So I guess what I was getting at was so what was the initial, what were the initial reasons for which they decided, well, there shouldn't be, or there probably would not be argon to begin with, and they went with that. What were the reasons that they arrived at to claim, yeah, we'll start with this assumption?
The reason was that when just before the rock forms, it's magma, it's liquid. And since argon is a gas, argon ought to be able to easily escape the liquid because it's lighter than the liquid, and so it would be buoyant, and so it would escape. But the problem is if there's so much argon, if there's so much that it really can't escape easily, then it remains even in the rock when it forms. So that was the assumption. Yeah, it seemed like a reasonable assumption, but it turned out it's not.
It's not. Yeah. You explained that just a while ago, but I couldn't grasp it. Now it makes a lot of sense. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's really fascinating. But so maybe don't trust them entirely on the who is it that claimed maybe don't trust it's trust the rock of ages, not the ages of rocks. I think that's it's actually a really good statement. But just to hop on this a bit more, so we have carbon dating, right? So that seems to be reasonably accurate. So there's a half-life of, I guess, 5,730 years, give or take. I'm not 100%, but something like that. And so this could go on, and maybe up to, I guess we don't use it for things that are older than 50,000 years, but we do use it within that, right? So
Yes, I would say secularists don't use it on things that they believe are older than 50,000 years because they would expect it would give an age of infinity because there should be 0 C14 left. The problem is we've tested it on things that are believed to be older than 50,000 years, and we do find C14 in them. And so that's an indication that they're not millions of years old. For example, certain remains from dinosaurs, if there's enough collagen left in them, so if there's carbon left in them, in every case we've tested, there's also C14 in it. And since C14 has a half-life of 5,730 years, you shouldn't find any C14. If these things are millions of years old, there shouldn't be one atom of C14 left in them. But we're typically finding that C14 is found in things that evolutionists believe to be millions of years old. Dinosaur remains, coal beds. You can take a chunk of coal. They used to assume that coal would have 0 C14 in it because it's 100 million years old. Shouldn't have any C14 in it in their view. But we've found that every chunk of coal we've tested has C14 in it. And that means all coal is less than 50,000 years old, or the C14 would not be measurable in it. Diamonds even, we found diamonds that have C14 in them. Diamonds are supposed to be 1 to 2 billion years old in the secular view, 1 to 2 billion years old. And yet they have C14 in them, which limits their age to less than 50,000 years. So there's a lot of stuff like that really doesn't fit the secular narrative. You just tend to not hear about it very much because it doesn't fit the secular view.
Well, yeah. I didn't know that. I just, well, that's new. Okay, I'll have to mull on that. That's actually really fascinating, and I really would love to think about that a bit more. So just on that a bit more. But so we do have C14, and so But isn't that still can we not still use it for things that are older than 6,000 years? So wouldn't that sort of be an issue for a young Earther, or would that not be? Am I making a mistake somewhere?
Well, keep in mind that even carbon dating, even though it tends to give accurate ages on things whose age we know, it's not perfect either. It's also based on assumptions. And one of the assumptions that C14 dating is based on is the assumption that the C14 to C12 ratio in the atmosphere has always been about what it is today. That's a uniformitarian assumption. We think it's wrong. We think that the C14 has been building up since creation. C14 is created in the atmosphere when cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms. And it may be that there was no C14 in the atmosphere when God first created the Earth. And if you don't account for that, then if you don't account for the fact that we think that by the time of the flood year, we think that the C14 to C12 ratio in the atmosphere was only about 2 to 5% what it is today. Now, if you don't compensate for that and you assume it's the same as it is today, that will inflate the age by a factor of about 10. And so instead of getting the actual age of maybe 5,000 years, you get an age of 50,000 years. But that's because you've made a false assumption that the rate that the C14 to C12 ratio in the atmosphere is the same then as it was as it is today. And we think that's false. Now, if you compensate for that, you can calibrate those ages and they all fall within the biblical time scale then. So I tell people, don't worry too much when they say, oh, but this carbon dates to 50,000 years. What that really means is it goes back to about the flood year. It's about 5,000 years old, but they didn't account for the different amount of C14 in the atmosphere in the past. So we'd expect carbon ages about 10 times older than the true age once you get back to the flood year. Carbon dating works accurately to about 3,000 years, and then it starts giving ages that are older than the true age up to a factor of about 10 when you get back to the flood year. Because of the change in the atmosphere.
Yeah. So at that time, conditions were way more different than what we'd expect, especially, I guess, during the flood time, and also at the point of creation. So I guess that's where the uniformitarian hypothesis sort of falls apart, because there's no way for us to. Right. Oh, this is interesting. Right. Yeah. So then, so can I ask? Because there is this, why don't they accept it, or at least why don't at least some of them, or do they? I'm not sure. Do some of them accept these sort of objections that the young Earth creationists have made, or are they just saying no? There are also legitimate objections to these objections. Is that what they?
So with the C14, the fact that we find C14 in diamonds, coal beds, dinosaurs, they can't dispute that because it's there. They can check it too. So there's no doubt that it's there. But would they accept that it means the Earth is young? No, because remember, they have a commitment, a philosophical commitment to naturalism and uniformitarianism. So they, no matter what evidence I present, they can't accept it as evidence for creation. But I got to tell you, it's really hard for them to explain away the C14 evidence. Usually the two explanations I hear, some will say it's contamination. When they remove the diamonds, they get C14 in it somehow. But that doesn't work because when we send them off to these companies, they dissolve it in acid. They get rid of everything on the exterior. They have to crush the diamond to test it. They have to destroy it, unfortunately, to test it for C14. So you can't contaminate a diamond. It's the hardest substance. You can't get new C14 in there. So that's not going to work. And then the other explanation that they will say is that somehow new C14 has been added to these substances that are buried deep down in the earth, usually by other forms of radioactive decay. And that's something that there was a research team, a creation science research team that investigated these things. And they already said that's not going to work. And because they went through the math and they found that, yes, radioactive decay can occasionally convert a nitrogen atom into C14. But the problem is there's not enough radioactive elements to account for the abundance of C14 that we find. You'd have to have 13,000 times more radioactive elements than we find deep down in the earth in order to recharge these nitrogens back into C14.
Oh,
so they have rescuing devices, but they're not good ones. Yeah,
they're not good ones. Right. Wow. Yeah. Well, that's these do well. Like they say, this strikes a blow to YEC. I guess all of these do strike a blow to the uniformitarian hypothesis and the entire evolutionary paradigm. But
Yep.
so with that as a given, but we do have well, maybe this might be slightly off track, but we do have theistic evolutionists, right? Who claim that it's compatible with biblical data. I'm not sure how accurate that is. I think we might have a problem with the original sin and all of that, but still, they
Mm.
they they still claim that it is compatible. I mean, Biologos has it, and I think Inspiring Philosophy is also a theistic evolutionist, if I'm not mistaken. And you've had quite a few conversations with them. I've watched some of them, especially with Eli, and really fascinating. He sort of conducts them. But so I think they use, at least I've heard Inspiring Philosophy use something like structural evolution. They say neo-Darwinian evolution, no, but structural evolution is where it's at, and it's sort of it's compatible with biblical data, and you can support evolution and be a Christian. Now, just to it does sound, well, I know it's stupid, but for some reason, well, yeah, maybe I can do both, and I won't have to be ridiculed by my colleagues, but still, it just sounds like a great proposition. But I know you disagree. Can you maybe explain why it's just not working? Why it is right?
Yeah, and you got it. You got it exactly right. There is a great temptation to want to say, because I'm a Christian, I believe the Bible, but maybe it doesn't really mean what it says. Maybe it allows for evolution. And people do that, I think, primarily because they want to be academically respected, or
Right.
because they've just been so inundated with evolution, they just can't consider that it might be wrong. When you've been taught something your whole life, it's tough to say, well, wow, I was wrong about that. It's tough to do that. But yeah, it won't work. It won't work. And I'm not saying that you can't be saved, you can't be a Christian and believe in evolution. I'm just saying it's inconsistent to do so, because the same Bible that teaches that Jesus is the only way to the Father also teaches that God created in 6 days. And so that doesn't allow for the billions of years. The Bible says that God created the organisms, or made them each according to their kinds. So there's certain kinds. The order's different. Evolution has birds evolving from reptiles. So reptiles come first,
Right.
then birds. But according to the Bible, birds are made on day 5. Land reptiles have been made on day 6. So
Oh,
they're
that's
later.
true.
So the
Yeah,
order, the
yeah.
order's different. Yeah. So the order's different. The mechanism's different. The fact that human beings are made in God's image, that means we're different from the animals. We're not descended from them. We're not related to apes. We're created in God's image. Apes are not. And they have some similarities, but they have a lot of differences. And as you pointed out, original sin is a huge problem, because the Bible makes it very clear that death is an enemy that came into the world when Adam sinned. Before Adam sinned, God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good, the Bible says. And so that means it's not going to have death and suffering in it. But we find fossils. Fossils are dead. And so, and some of them have
Yeah.
evidence of disease in them, arthritis, cancer, and so on. And so, if you find a dead thing and you say, I think this is 100 million years old, you've got a theological problem, because you got death before Adam sinned. In fact, you got death before Adam existed, because we all
Yeah.
agree human beings don't go back 100 million years. So I think that's really one of the big kickers that makes theistic evolution impossible. Evolution cannot be harmonized with the Bible, because evolution requires millions of years of death and suffering before man. But the Bible teaches that man is responsible for the death and suffering that came into a world that was originally good. And death is an enemy that Christ will destroy. And that's something that we look forward to. But death came into the world as a result of Adam's sin, and that makes it incompatible with evolution, along with all the details that are given in Genesis.
Yeah, and that is true. So maybe this might be a stupid question, but I'll ask anyway because I have thought, because I did think about it once, because so in the beginning, I mean, there would have been, I don't know, small bacteria and stuff like that going on around, wouldn't they? And would they have been crushed or under the I guess under the foot of Adam, or when they opened up a fruit? I don't know, but wouldn't something like that have happened? Wouldn't some sort of death have been there in the beginning, or was it completely devoid of any death in that sense?
I'm glad you asked that. A lot of people ask me that. The interesting thing, biblically, things like bacteria are not considered alive, or individual cells in our body, which we think of it. Well, that's a lot. human beings are alive. But according to scripture, the Bible uses a special word called nephesh. That's the Hebrew word for life. Nephesh kai, living creature. And it applies to human beings and it applies to animals. And human beings are living, we're alive. Animals are living, they're alive. Plants, bacteria, things like that are not classified as living. And modern biologists classify them as life, but they're not using the same criteria the Bible's using, kind of like kind and species, like we talked about earlier.
Right,
The
right.
biblical definition of life is different from the modern scientific definition. So yeah, you can eat plants and that you digest it and that becomes part of your body, but are you killing a plant? Well, technically it's not really alive to begin with in the biblical sense of the term. And so when your immune system destroys bacteria and recycles them, you're not killing anything in a biblical sense because they're not alive to begin with. And so they're kind of in a different
Right.
category. Now we can poetically or metaphorically talk about a dead tree, but it was never really alive in the biblical sense, which may involve things like consciousness or desires, things like that.
Oh, that's so well. Yeah. So nefesh. Okay. Right. Right.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That actually makes sense. Yes. Yes. That is true. Just on the word tree, dendrochronology is that isn't that a way that they claim that it's older than 6,000 or because apparently you can use dendrochronology
Yeah.
to claim that, but
A few of them will do that. I think ones that are more knowledgeable of dendrochronology probably would not use that argument. But dendrochronology, of course, refers to tree rings, and the standard mantra is every year you get one tree ring. And so you cut down a tree and you count the number of rings, and that's how old the tree is. And that's a pretty good approximation. It's not exact because we know that trees can produce, on some occasions, multiple rings in one year.
right.
You can get up to 5 rings in one year in certain trees. We know scientifically that that's possible, and there's different circumstances under which that would happen. By the way, one of the circumstances is if you have a really pleasant, mild summer or a short winter, you can get multiple rings that way. And we think those are exactly the conditions that would have existed right after the flood. We think the flood caused an ice age, which would have made people have misconceptions of the ice age, but it was actually a very pleasant time to be on Earth. We
Oh,
think
it's not
Abraham and
woolly mammoth and all of that. That's not
right.
what's
Well, yeah,
going.
there would have been woolly mammoths, yeah. But people assume when we talk about the ice age that the Earth was just a frozen ice ball, and that's not the case. There would have been places on Earth that were tropical during the ice age. It's just there was more ice than there is today. Today, the land is 10% covered by glaciers. During the peak of the ice age, it was 30% covered by glaciers. So there was
Right.
more
Right.
ice.
Yeah.
But there were still places that were very nice. And the ice age produced mild seasons. You'd had very mild, cool, relatively cool summers, relatively warm winters. And those are the ideal conditions for producing multiple rings in trees. So again, my point is if you don't compensate for that, if you assume one ring is 1 year, oh, this gives you more than 6,000 rings. Well, we'd expect that because you can get multiple rings in a year. But you don't find trees with a million rings. You don't.
Right.
The trees
Right.
that we find are consistent with the biblical time scale, especially if you allow for the fact that you can get up to 5 rings per year in ideal circumstances, the very circumstances we think would have existed right after the flood during the 700 years or so after the flood.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, yeah. What is fascinating about all of this is that there's a presupposition of methodological naturalism that sort of underpins all of this, right? And
Yeah,
we don't work in that fashion. Well, yeah, that's actually
right.
really. um, so like yeah, but again, they'd say, and I've heard people say that, but shouldn't you assume, even if you're a Christian, should you assume at least not metaphysical, but at least methodological naturalism that we do need to assume that to do scientific research? And I don't know, I just well, maybe that
I was
sounds
always taught
reasonable.
that. I was always
Yeah.
taught that. It's not true. It's something I would reject now. So methodological naturalism is the belief that nature is all that there is. And so really you can't have a God, or you can have a God, but he has to be within nature. He can't be transcendent. You can't have the biblical God. Let's put it
No.
that way.
No. Yeah.
Methodological naturalism is basically, as a method, you should pretend that God doesn't exist when you're doing your science.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the ironic thing about that is, I would say, as a Christian, I would say, if God doesn't exist, it makes no sense to do science. It makes no sense to expect orderliness in a chance universe. The reason I can do science as a PhD astrophysicist is because God has promised me to uphold things in a consistent way, at least some things in a consistent way. In Genesis 8:22, God promised that there are basic cycles in nature, like the day and night cycle and the seasons, that will continue as long as the earth remains. And so I can count on that. I can expect orderliness in the universe. And then science is about probing those things. And science really is about studying the systematic, predictable way that God normally upholds his creation. Now, if there's no God, there's no reason to expect a predictable, orderly, upheld creation. It's just chance. It's just chance. And so I would say, as a scientist, it only makes sense to do science if you believe in a God, and if you believe in the biblical God who upholds things in a consistent fashion and has told us that in his word. And so the ironic thing is, when secular scientists do science, and they can do that, but they're being inconsistent because they're ignoring the God that makes that science possible.
Oh, that's true. That is true. Yeah, yeah. The presupposition that God exists is almost necessary to do any. That's actually really fascinating. Yeah. On this whole topic, so this is right. We use genetic algorithms, right? I mean, when we want to solve something like an abstract problem, or it's just fun. So I use it sometimes when I do hyperparameter optimization, right? So building a neural network, and sometimes you do it with search, but sometimes it's fun to use something like a genetic algorithm to give you the optimal hyperparameters for your network. Now, what is fascinating about genetic algorithms, subset of evolutionary algorithms, is that it sort of follows the idea, right? So there's a population, we've got whatever it is, and then we've got a fitness criterion, and then we've got the crossover, the random mutation, and then the iteration of the whole process, and you get the optimized solution. Really fun. But then you think, well, the fact that this works so well, like in the traveling salesman problem, or even in the hyperparameter optimization, and again, in a lot of these optimization problems, sort of seem to suggest that, well, isn't evolution sort of baked in? But again, sorry, it just sort of sounds, it looks like, wow, the fact that this works here, maybe this is in the grand scheme of things, and that is why it works so well here.
Gotcha.
Yeah, can I just ask you about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think that that these genetic algorithms are very similar to the way that God upholds his creation today. I would say they're not evolutionary. They're consistent with the creation idea of variation and adaptation within a kind. Because the fact is, we do have this kind of thing occurring naturally. Darwin's finches, or anything in nature that has variations. Some variations are more conducive to survival than other variations, and those are the ones that survive. And they reproduce, and pretty soon the whole population has that variation. And you can do the same kind of thing with computer algorithms, and it works. But I would argue there's nothing that requires common descent or neo-Darwinian evolution for that to happen. It's just a great example of adaptation within a kind. And you'd say, well, why couldn't that lead to sort of a macro evolution where you have one kind changing into another? And I'll give you the difference. The problem is, well, there's different ways I could explain this. Let me think. I think probably the easiest way to explain it is to point out that the kinds of mutations that occur in nature, where you get sections of the DNA scrambled, they reduce the genetic information. They don't increase it. They scramble some instructions. It's like if you had a document and you had a typo in it. It would reduce the information in the document, right? Now, there's certain circumstances where you have a sentence in a paper that's not very good anyway, and by scrambling it, it's like, or removing it, even deleting it, it makes the paper better because it wasn't good to begin with. Okay, fine, that can happen. That can happen in nature. There's certain mutations that actually have survival value. That does happen. But the problem is, in order to turn something like a bacteria into a horse, you'd have to add brand new information. And we don't see that happening in nature. And so it's like, an article becoming better by gaining new sentences and it doesn't happen. We don't find instances in nature of brand new information being added to the genome. And so evolutionists, they're welcome to talk about good mutations that occasionally help an organism survive. And I can talk about some of those if you're interested. But because I agree with those, that does happen, but it happens by removing information. And so it's not going to turn a bacteria into a horse because you would need brand new information to do that. And so I'm all for genetic algorithms because I think they mimic the way God actually upholds his creation, which is not evolution, but variation within a kind. and some variations are more conducive to survival, and they tend to survive. And so sure enough, Darwin's finches, the beaks that are the best suited for that particular environment, those are the birds tend to have most of those beaks. And so that's very similar with what we do with computing. So I would say that has nothing to do with evolution. It has to do with adaptation. It has to do with variation within a kind, natural selection, things that I as a creationist believe in.
So they say, right, so the mutations are usually neutral, sometimes deleterious, but sometimes they might actually be beneficial. And that's
But they
it.
always remove information. Yeah.
But they always remove, right?
Remove information or are neutral. They don't add brand new information.
So you can't go from one thing to another. So it's like you mentioned, you won't. Yeah, right, yeah. That's that's actually really fascinating. Can you maybe, so which are the ones that are beneficial? What is an example of one? Yeah.
One example, there is there's several I could give. One of them, there's a mutation that causes an insect's wings not to form properly. And so the insect is unable to fly, which normally would be a bad thing. But there are certain islands where it's very windy, and insects that can fly, when they're flying, they tend to be blown away by the wind into the ocean and they die. And so we find that on small islands, a lot of insects have mutations that cause their wings not to form properly because they can't fly. And in that environment, it actually helps them survive. So that's one example. Yeah. Another example would be there's different ways this can happen, but bacteria. There's a certain bacteria called H. pylori, which causes stomach ulcers. And the way you get rid of that is you take an antibiotic. And the antibiotic, which your body can't process, but the bacteria can. The bacteria has an enzyme in him that when it reacts with that antibiotic, converts it into a poison, which kills the bacterium. But there's a mutated form. There's a mutated form of H. pylori that the gene that produces that enzyme is damaged. And so he can't produce very much of that enzyme at all. And so the antibiotic goes into him and it just sits there because he lacks the ability to convert it into a poison because he's missing some instructions. And so that bacterium is actually better able to survive. He's antibiotic resistant because of a damaged gene. But it's not because he gained new instructions. It's because he lost some instructions. It's just that in that environment, it helps him survive. So those are two quick examples of mutations that in a particular environment are beneficial.
Oh, that's actually really interesting because so they claim, and so sometimes the strength of a theory is usually how predictive it is, right? How strong, how well it can predict things. It's really cool. We love that. But so in our case, in evolution, they claim that so antibiotic resistance is, again, they claim, okay, just look at this example of the predictive power of evolution when we claim that the drug-resistant bacteria can occur because of random mutation and evolution. Look at how that happens, and therefore this shows the predictive power of evolution, which therefore is true. Whereas what has the young Earth creationist assumption ever been able to predict? Something like that, and so.
But we would predict the same thing. We would predict exactly the same thing because we believe in variation within a kind, and we believe in mutations.
There's
we believe
a difference.
In natural selection.
We believe in those too.
Yeah, but what I would say, what the evolutionists, what you should be predicting, if you really believe in evolution, is that some mutations add new information to the genome. Because if you're going to turn bacteria into horses, you have to get horses have information bacteria do not have. So you'd have to have mutations that add brand new instructions. We predict you won't find those, and so far we've been right. We've been right.
So far there have been no instances where anyone's been able to. Right. Yeah. Oh, that's true. That is true. It's actually right on the face of it, but still, when it's hard to think in that fashion because when you're bombarded with all of these papers and all of these things, you just, well, maybe you're right. There's no way I can debunk any of this, but this is really fascinating. I want to delve into this. Sounds really cool. So, maybe I can ask you a bit more. We'll just move in a slightly different direction because it's something that you've done, the Anisotropic Synchrony Convention. And can I ask you about that? Because this Starlight Problem, I guess, people that is something that has been sort of powered as an objection to young Earth creationism, that we've got these planets and stars that are billions of light years away. How on earth can we be young Earth if light from those distant stars have reached us? Now you've claimed that there is a way in which this could happen, and that is the Synchrony Convention, where the speed of light, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just going to put out a summary here, and then please go on. So, but the starlight from those reaches the observer instantaneously. So that is in an instant, and then the return speed, so the speed from the observer back, is actually way slower. Therefore, the total average speed would be c3 into 10 raised to 8 meter per second. So
Mhm.
so this is the ASC view. Am I right here? And
Yeah,
could you maybe expand on that and claim why? So why isn't it accepted by the broader scientific community? Because I've heard that, well, no, we can't accept that, or some people claim no, ASCs is not consistent. I've heard that it's not consistent with Einstein's theory of relativity. I don't know. Could you maybe get into that as to why they claim all of
sure.
those things?
Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, secular physicists who are knowledgeable of Einstein's relativity would not disagree with me. They would agree with me that the speed of light in one direction, and by the way, I gotta be careful about this. I'm not saying the speed of light toward an observer has to be instantaneous. I'm saying we're allowed to define it that way. The one-way speed of light, God has given us some freedom in how we define now. And that allows the one-way speed of light to be different in one direction than it is in the other. And it's our choice. That's the weird thing, because people think, well, it's got to either be this speed or that speed. But one of the things Einstein discovered is that space and time are not the absolute things that people assume they are.
Right.
And one consequence of that is that the speed of light in one direction is not measured objectively, but rather it's stipulated. We get to define it, and that tells us how to synchronize clocks. And then if we measure it with our synchronized clocks, we'll find that it's whatever we chose it to be. Now, the round trip speed of light, the speed of light, the average speed of light in both directions is set by God. And that can't be changed. In vacuum, that's always the same and nothing can change that. But the speed in one direction can be as high as infinity as long as the return speed is such that the average is c, 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. And this is something that Einstein knew about and wrote about. So this isn't something I came up with. All I did
Really?
was apply this. Yeah, all I did was apply this to biblical creation and show that it solves the starlight problem. But Albert Einstein wrote, let me see if I can quote it from memory. He's talking about the one-way speed of light. He says the one-way
Yeah.
speed of light is in reality neither a supposition nor a hypothesis about the physical nature of light, but a stipulation which I can make of my own free will in order to arrive at a definition of simultaneity. And that's in his 1916 book. That's an English translation of it, but that's what he said. So the one-way speed of light is something we get to choose of our own free will. And I thought, why not choose it to be infinity toward us? Because that's the way all ancient cultures did. All ancient cultures until the 1600s, when they saw something in space, they would say it's happening now. They would assume that the speed of light is instantaneous. And Einstein says they're not wrong. He says you
Whoa.
can do it other ways. You can do it other ways
Right.
too. You could say it actually happened a long time ago. That's not wrong either. But my point is, when the Bible talks about the stars being made on day four, it would be using that ancient convention in which they're made on day four and their light reaches Earth immediately. And I would argue that most physicists who are knowledgeable of relativity, not all of them, but most of them who are knowledgeable of relativity would agree with me. And in fact, there was a paper written by Sarkar and Stachel, and these are secular physicists. One of them is very anti-creationist. He doesn't like creationists, but they also wrote about the idea of light coming toward Earth being instantaneous, and realized that it's perfectly fine to define it that way. So I would say physicists who are knowledgeable of relativity would agree with me. Now, they might disagree that they would disagree that the universe is young.
Right.
They
Right.
would disagree with, but they would not say that light, distant starlight, proves an old universe if they're knowledgeable of relativity. It's the secularists who are not knowledgeable of physics who make that argument.
Right, right. Well, because at least sometimes it sounds counterintuitive. Oh, it just happens. No, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it spends years and comes in. But again, when you think about it, yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. Well, I mean, it's the ASC is something I've really, a huge fan of when you wrote about it, and I wanted to ask you, and I'm really glad I got the opportunity to be able to ask you directly that question, and it's just fascinating, and uh, so these things are answers, legitimate answers to these objections that they posit. And when we read them, we think, yes, that's true, remarkable. And then maybe, so this is a broader question, but then you go out and then someone else comes up with some new paper that says, well, on some random topic that is in relation to this, and then say, well, look at this paper. Look at how this sort of debunks whatever your position is. And I've heard you claim that this can happen. And but what you need is the underlying presuppositions to sort of deal with that. And I guess that's where the whole presuppositional apologetics comes in. So you have the laws of logic, the principle of induction, all of that, which is really fascinating. And maybe we can get into a bit of that if time allows us. So maybe I can just ask you about one or two of those. One of them would be how do mathematical truths sort of point to the existence of God, which I think is a really fascinating thing. I'd love it, and if you could sort of expand on that, because it's just fun.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of interesting because I ran into I was talking with a young lady one time she was claimed to be an atheist. And she said, I prayed and prayed that God would show me himself. And I prayed and prayed about it. And he never did. I said, oh, really? What's your major? Math? And she said, I'm majoring in mathematics. And I'm like, boy, did God answer your prayer. What do you think you're studying? What do you think you're studying? Numbers. Well, what are numbers? Numbers are a concept of quantity. Now, quantity is like how much of something there is. And numbers are a concept of quantity. What's a concept? A concept is something that exists in the mind. Okay, so numbers exist in the mind. Whose mind? Well, I mean, if I'm thinking about a number, they exist in my mind, but there are an infinite number of numbers. I can't think of them all because my mind's finite. Whose mind do numbers exist? I mean, it's interesting. Where do numbers come from? Because mathematical truths existed before human beings. So it's not that where do these numbers exist? In whose mind do these numbers exist? It's not just ours, because they existed before our minds evolved, in your view. And I would argue, well, they exist in the mind of God. And so, pardon me. So mathematical truths, the reason that there are mathematical truths is because math is the way God thinks about numbers. And so when you're studying math, you're really doing theology. You're learning to think in a way that's consistent with God's character. And people will object to that. No, I'm not. Hey, come up with another explanation that makes sense. And I don't think you can, because, well, human beings invented math. Really? Because it's awfully hard. If we came up with it, I think we would have made it a lot simpler. Instead of, 2 + 2 equaling 4, let's make everything equal 1. That would be a lot easier. But you see, we didn't invent math. We discovered mathematical truths, which means they were already there. But, Pythagoras, he didn't invent Pythagorean theorem. Triangles still added up that way before Pythagoras discovered it. So these truths have existed before human beings. We've just discovered them. So whose thoughts are we discovering? It would have to be the mind of God, because it's numbers are infinite. And so the mind who's responsible for mathematical truths would have to be an infinite mind. It would have to be the mind of God.
Oh, that's just right. Like, really interesting. Maybe I can just sort of push back a little bit. It probably would make a lot of, but yeah, maybe let me just ask you about this, because so couldn't mathematical objects be constructs of the human mind and meaningful only in the context of human activity? So the existence of those truths don't necessitate a divine being as such, but human cognition and conventions. I know you kind of answered that, but it sort of is there, and maybe I can get you to. Can you? So because
yeah, well, if my mind is responsible for mathematical truths and your mind is responsible for mathematical truths, our minds are different, and so we would have different mathematical truths. So the idea that mathematicians are really just doing self-reflection, they're just learning about their own mind. That's not true to the history of mathematics.
It sounds
because
stupid,
in fact,
yeah,
but when you think about it, mathematics can't be a result of human thinking, because there were certain mathematical truths, like the Greeks discovered the so-called irrational numbers,
right.
Numbers that can't be expressed as a ratio of two integers.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about that, the Greeks hated irrational numbers. This was the first time in history where human beings had discovered something in math that they weren't expecting and that they didn't want. They wanted all numbers to be expressed as a over b. And when the Pythagorean theorem, however, led to certain numbers that cannot be expressed as a over b, where a and b are two finite integers. There are these irrational numbers like pi or the square root of 2,
right.
that when you express them in a decimal, they go on forever. And the Greeks hated that. But it was a result of math. It's the result of the fact that these mathematical truths were not reflecting their thinking; they were reflecting the thinking of God, and they happened to not like some of God's thoughts. But my point is, if they had been just reflections of their own thinking, they would never have come up with irrational numbers. And there's lots of things like that in math. There are things that we don't know whether or not they're true. There are certain theorems that are
Wouldn't
out
we
there
have
that to this day we don't know if they're true or not.
would we have come up with imaginary numbers? I don't think would that have come
No,
up either?
it's the same way with imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers come out of the result of the fact that there are certain solutions to quadratic equations, for example, that
Right.
cannot be expressed as a positive or negative number or zero. There are other numbers. There are numbers that are out there that are not positive, not negative, not zero. Numbers that when you square them, you get a negative, and that resulted in these so-called imaginary numbers. And the neat thing about imaginary numbers is they're when you combine those with real numbers, you get a two-dimensional grid. Numbers are inherently
Yeah.
two-dimensional. And that's cool. And you think, and mathematicians then began thinking, well, that'd be, because there's certain physics problems. When I took my fluids dynamics class, there are certain fluid situations you can solve using complex, aka imaginary
Right.
numbers,
Using that. Yeah.
but only in two dimensions, because numbers are two-dimensional. And so mathematicians would have loved for there to be a third dimension in numbers so we could apply it to our physical universe. But there's not. Numbers are two-dimensional because God's mind has decided that numbers are two-dimensional. And so that's another example of something that we would have liked them to be three-dimensional. We'd like there to be a third axis, but there's not for numbers. I mean, there are things, there are other conceptual quantities like quaternions that are sort of like numbers that are four-dimensional, but they're not numbers. And so numbers are two-dimensional. And so that's an example of the fact that math is not something that human beings invented. It's something we discovered, and therefore it's something that goes beyond us. It's something that existed before we existed, because we've discovered things that we kind of wish we hadn't in some cases. And there are mathematical truths we still don't know the answer to.
Right. Yeah. So I guess the paper was it Eugene Wigner about the unreasonable effectiveness of math. I guess it's sort of speaking to the same thing. It is fascinating, but you'll hear others say, well, no, it's human centric. But you've just really claimed, and you've made really clear arguments as to why that ought not to be the case. And to be honest, it just sounds flimsy, but it's a sort of way that people say, well, no, we don't need to invoke God in any of this. You can sort of claim that it's human constructivism, or it's always human centric, which is fun, right? I mean, most of these things are anthropocentric. It's almost always human centric, and you think, well, God at the beginning saying, just don't focus too much on the man is not the measure of all things. God is. If you start going that route, you'll end up in a lot of problems.
Yeah, well, that was Eve's sin. I mean, the way Satan tempted Eve, he says, you'll be like God if you eat this.
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
And so, and we're all tempted in the same way. We want to think that it's all about us, when in reality it's all about God. And we need to remember we're the creation, he's the creator. But it's always a human temptation to make everything about us. It's not. It's all about God.
Right. So that's a part of mathematical truths. So I guess a very similar way would be about the laws of logic, which is again something that I've heard presuppositional apologists and you talk about the laws of logic and how they point to the existence of God. And then Dr. James Anderson, who I interviewed a while ago, he wrote about the law of non-contradiction. Just amazing paper. Right? I love that discussion. So maybe I can ask you this too. But are there cases where the classical laws of logic are not exactly followed through? So I've heard some people claim that maybe quantum mechanical systems, so the underlying nature of all of reality, might not exactly follow classical laws of logic. Now, I mean, my understanding of it is limited only as far as my mechanical engineering degree goes. But if so what I do know about this is there's the double slit experiment, there's the superposition thing going on, and there's some sort of action going, and then there are multiple interpretations. We've got the Copenhagen, all of those things. But is it true that that there is some that it does something? It's not actually following the law of non-contradiction, or maybe the law of excluded middle, or is it just they do actually follow those laws, and we're just maybe we just don't understand it yet? Is that it?
Yeah, more of the latter. Yeah, so I would argue that quantum mechanics, as with all aspects of reality, obeys perfectly the laws of logic, as it would have to. I would say, as a Christian, laws of logic reflect God's thinking. It's God's thinking that controls the universe. Therefore, the universe must obey logic. And that includes quantum mechanics principles. And then the case where people think they have a counterexample is with like Schrodinger's cat, where you
Right.
can have something that's there and not there at the same time in the same sense. But that's really just a way of thinking about something, a way of thinking about a particle that's not really a particle at all. It exists as a wave until it's
Yeah.
observed.
The wave
But
function
yeah, but there,
collapses and you've got it.
yeah,
Right.
there's the so-called Copenhagen interpretation, which is that, until you observe the particle, it's in all possible states at the same time. That's just a way of thinking about really a wave function. I would say really what's going on is the particle doesn't exist as a particle, as a discrete location in space, but exists in multiple locations in space, like a wave that's spreading out until it's observed, and then it behaves like a particle. But the thing is, it never behaves like a wave and particle at the same time and in the same sense. It behaves like a wave when you're not observing it, and it'll go through both slits and interfere with itself. But then once it has to make a decision where it's going to land, or once you make an observation of it, it will then have a discrete position. So there's no violation of the law of non-contradiction. Now, it's
Right.
weird. It's counterintuitive.
Yes, that is, yeah.
People did not expect quantum to behave that way, quantum phenomena to behave that way. But there's no violation of laws of logic. And I would argue if it did violate laws of logic, we could never have discovered it, because we used logic to figure
That's
these things
true.
out.
That's true. Oh, that's actually true. Yeah, it couldn't violate them. We used that to discover it in the first place. That's true. Oh, yeah. Right, yeah. So there isn't. So then I guess because people try, and I did ask Dr. Anderson about this objection about the dilotheist. I guess it's called dilotheism, where they claim that you can have some sort of statements that can sort of break the laws of logic. But again, I think it's sort of a semantic game. It's not actually. I mean,
It is. You're exactly
right?
right. It's a semantic game. Yeah. Because because the cases they'll be like, if you're, let's say you're standing in the doorway, and you could say you're in the room, and it's not the case that you're in the room, but not in the same sense. The law of non-contradiction is A and not A at the same time and in the same sense. So what's the sense in which you're in the room? The sense is my front half's in the room. What's the sense in which you're not in the room?
Right,
My
right.
back half is not in the room. That's a different sense. You see,
That's
so
true.
these are semantic. They're semantic games. They don't actually violate the laws of logic.
It's just because they want to. Well, apparently a lot of people hate Presup and just hate it with the sort of intense ferocity, which makes you wonder, why is that? But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and they make up all of these things, and so I've tried to read up on as much as I can to sort of understand what are the objections. And I mean, some of these are just stupid. Again, yeah, stuff like this. Yeah, you're right. It's just the semantic games that they play to sort of confuse you. Others seem to have a bit more teeth, which is why I wanted to ask you a couple of them, and if I can, maybe a bit more. So the problem of induction is also something that presuppositional apologists regularly talk about, and
Mhm.
and yeah. Now, couldn't we say, but maybe I'm not putting this right, but it's couldn't we say that, well, that's just how the universe is empirically observed, and we use that for our science. So yeah, we sort of have to rely on that, because otherwise we can't do it, and so it's just sort of an assumption. But you don't have to invoke God for it. Even as I'm talking about it, it sounds you actually do. But still, yeah. But can you maybe expand on that? Because I haven't fully been able to. Yeah, please go on.
Sure. As I recall, Greg Bonson was asked that question one time, or that's the way an atheist came back. He says, well, maybe that's just the way the universe is. And Bonson said, can you imagine if I answered the debate that way? If somebody said, how do you know that God exists? Hey, that's just the way it is. God just
That is true.
exists.
Wow, that is true.
And I've always thought that's a pretty good counter argument. But yeah, so a rational person has a good reason for what he believes. And I, as a Christian, have a good reason to believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, because I have a promise from God. And the sun has always risen in the past. The Bible promises day and night will continue as long as the earth remains, Genesis 8:22. So I have a good reason to believe that there are cycles of nature that will continue in the future as they have in the past. If somebody says, well, maybe that's just the way it is. Okay, but how do you know? How do you know that? If he says, well, I just believe it, well, I just believe you're wrong. Right? I mean, if he doesn't have a reason, then he's not being rational. Rational people have a good reason for what they believe. And so that's the whole point of the transcendental argument, that's used by presuppositional apologists like myself, I'm a presuppositionalist, is that unless you presuppose the biblical God, you can't justify things like induction. Nobody's saying you can't use it. You can profess to not believe in God and still use induction, but the point is it makes no sense. Induction only makes sense if there's a God who controls time, who's beyond time, who has promised to control the future like he has the past in terms of basic cycles. That's what allows us to make predictions about things like tomorrow's sunrise. It's what allows us to use past experience as the basis for what's likely to happen in the future. And there is nothing apart from God that can answer that. The secular philosopher David Hume was reduced to utter skepticism on the problem of induction. That's one
Right,
reason
yeah.
I love induction, because all science is based on it. I'm a
Yeah,
scientist, so
yeah.
I use it all the time. And there is no rational justification for it apart from the Christian worldview. I've never seen anybody be able to come up with a rational justification for induction apart from the Christian worldview.
That's true. Yeah, yeah. Um, the, so maybe just as a counter argument. So couldn't it be true that okay, the Big Bang happened, and or whatever it is that caused this to happen happened, and then we've got atoms, and we've got fundamental particles that have built up the universe, and they follow certain laws, and that is why nature behaves in this fashion, because of how these atoms are oriented, because of how the structure of reality itself is oriented. And that is why we can expect the past and the future to be like the past, because of the nature of reality in and of itself. Yeah, couldn't that be a way to sort of claim, I guess, oppose in some way without invoking God? I don't know. Probably not, but still.
Oh, that's good. That's good. No, Gordon Stein tried that solution in the Bonson-Stein debate. That's basically what he said. Maybe that's the way matter is.
Right.
And Bonson pointed out, you don't really know the way matter is. All you can say is, in my experience, it seems like it's behaved this way. And then when you mutter under your breath, and therefore I expect it always will, then you're assuming induction. All you can do at best is say, in the past, matter has behaved this way. And if you want to say, therefore, in the future, it'll behave that way, you're assuming the future will be like the past, which is the very thing I'm asking you to justify.
That's
So
true.
yeah. So even if I grant you, for the sake of argument, let's assume that in the past, matter was such that the future reflected the past. I'll grant you that, even though I'm being very generous, because even there you're assuming that your memory is reliable, which you can't apart from the Christian worldview. But let's assume that in the past,
Yeah.
matter was such that the future reflected the past. You're assuming that in the future, matter will be such that the future will reflect the past. But how do you know that unless you already know the future will be like the past? The very thing I'm expecting.
That's true. Oh, that's true. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is true. Yeah, yeah, wow. Yeah, that's true. That's actually a really strong argument against these claims, because yeah, there's just no way you're sort of caught in a trap. There's no way to get out of it unless you say no. It is God who sustains all of nature by His providence and command. Because outside of that, there's no way you could reliably say that the future will be like the past. It's just yeah, that's true. Wow. That's actually really a really strong argument against these claims. I mean, I've heard a lot of these people say no, 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 but still, yeah. I mean, if you're honest enough, I don't think you can sort of claim anything else apart from yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Wow. So when you're using a transcendental form of argumentation, you've got the laws of logic again, which we've discussed, and you've got the problem of induction. I'm guessing you could use something like mathematical truths, but so these are all the I guess forms in which we use the transcendental argument. But I guess the root of it is that unless you presuppose the existence of God, intelligibility almost or any sort of rational experience of the human world makes no sense. I guess that's the way in which you can put it, right?
Yep.
Uh,
Exactly.
so, so here's the thing, and for some reason or the other, and maybe it's just the way in which sometimes this is put forth, or maybe it's too intellectual. Sometimes maybe it's not, but it fails to persuade a lot of people, or maybe not honest people, but still. And shouldn't an argument have a strong persuasive power? Now I know that there's a lot of assumptions that the other party has to be honest. They can't just be. They can always trying to poke holes here, right? But still, I'll just ask this because it seems as though, well, even a lot of atheists would say, well, no, I accept classical ways of dealing with classical apologetic views, right? So you've got the universe begins to exist and therefore it has a cause, and all of those are like which I love. But when it comes to the precept side of things, well, no, that's just a fool's errand. That's the worst wrong of Christianity. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people make all of these arguments. I don't fall into either camp, but I'm a huge fan of the work that you do and the work that a lot of precept apologists do. I love reading about the work that you do, but I think why does it? Maybe it's not that it fails to have a persuasive power, but for some reason or the other, I hear a lot of people claim, no, I can't stand this. Classical, yes. Evidential, wow, or at least evidential, yes. But precept, no. It's just anti-intellectual circular nonsense. Although, to be honest, I don't think it is. I think it's really sound, and I don't really think they have an argument to a lot of the claims. But still, why does it lack this sort of persuasive power? Do you think?
I'm not sure that it does, but keep
No,
in
but
mind,
yeah, I'm
keep
not
in
saying it
mind,
does.
my job as an apologist is to give a defense, and I
Right.
leave persuasion up to the Holy Spirit. So I'm not aiming to persuade someone. No, I want to be winsome in my arguments. I want to be persuasive, but I can't change somebody's heart. Only God can do that. When it comes to an issue of faith in God, that's kind of a special category. That's something the Bible tells us, that men are not neutral when it comes to this. You talk about an honest
Yeah.
person. There aren't any, according to Scripture. When it comes to faith in God, we're all wicked, and we rebel against God. There's none righteous, no, not one. God has to turn our heart around. So I think, and I have seen people come to faith in Christ after they've read a presuppositional argument. I've had people read the book, The Ultimate Proof of Creation, and they've come to faith in Christ. God used that as part of the means to bring faith to them. So I think it's actually the most effective method. Now, the reason people don't like it is because I think it's because it's God focused, it's not man focused. The other
Yes,
methods
yes,
are
it's
man
true.
focused. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier, about we like to make it all about us.
Yeah,
And in
yeah.
classical and evidential apologists, it's like, let me show you, I'll show you how God exists. Whereas in the presuppositional approach, it's you already know God exists. He's obvious, he's made himself known to you, but you hate him. You suppress the truth and unrighteousness. That's your problem.
Right,
And
right.
people don't like to hear that. They don't, but it's the truth. People don't like to hear that they're in rebellion against God. They like to think they're neutral. And classical and evidential apologists let them continue to believe the lie that they're neutral. And if they just had enough evidence, they'd believe in God. Whereas the presuppositional apologist is honest enough to tell you the truth. You're not neutral. You are in rebellion against God. If you're not a Christian, you're in rebellion against God, and your position reduces to absurdity. And that's why I think it's off-putting to many people, because it's true and it describes their true nature. And I think we need to be gentle in the way that we present that, but nonetheless, it goes back to men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. That's what the Bible says.
Yes, yeah, yeah. They suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Yeah. So I guess this sort of gets to the heart of the matter, and so I guess it's sort of no,
Yes.
this is too much. Yeah, yeah. Maybe the other methods have a more of a sort of it's easier to interact with them, but with the presuppositional approach, yeah, you start with the Christian God of the scriptures. It's not even a theistic conception, which I guess others use, and then move to Jesus, and then the evidence of Christ and the resurrection. But this is sort of starting from the presupposition that the God of the Bible exists and has to exist for any sort of intelligible experience. So yeah, it makes sense that this has the most sort of objections to it. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, yeah, I think it certainly is extremely persuasive. It's just that and maybe it's these circles that I'm in or the people that I talk to, but a lot of these guys would say, no, 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 don't use that. I mean, classical. Even some Christians, I've heard some Christians who would say, no, no. I mean, let's use classical ways of dealing with this or evidential, but please don't. And and to be another thing that I've noticed is that those who claim that also not always, but sometimes fall into the theistic evolutionist camp, whereas in the other side, it's almost always the young Earth camp, which is also funny. But I guess there's pretty strong reasons why that is. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a connection between the two. I did a debate one time. It was a three-way debate, and they wanted me to defend both young Earth creation and also presuppositional apologetics. And I thought that's kind of a weird debate. And then I thought, well, there is a connection between the two, because in both cases, I would argue that we have the highest view of Scripture, in that we actually believe that God created the way he says he did. And we actually believe that the unbeliever is the way that God says he is in Romans 1, where God has made himself known to everyone, right? The wrath of God, Romans 1:18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. So the Bible tells me that all unbelievers know God in their heart of hearts, but they hate him. They suppress the truth and unrighteousness. And I believe that. I believe that's true. And so when I approach a person and they say, I'm an atheist, I don't believe that person, because the Bible tells me, no, you're not. The Bible tells me you believe in God and you hate him. And so you're trying to pretend that you don't believe in the existence of God. You're trying to convince me, you're trying to convince yourself, but in reality, you do know God. Now, see, the classical and evidential apologists, they would go along with the lie. They would say, oh, you really don't believe in God. Well, let me offer you evidence of God. Whereas I, as a
Right, right.
presupposition, believe Romans 1, I would say, I don't have to do that. You already know God. And what I'm going to do is expose your suppressed knowledge of God. So it's powerful. Now, I take your point, though, because most people are so badly, they're such bad thinkers that it's easier to use a bad argument on them to convince them. And I would argue that a lot of the arguments that evidentialists and classical apologists use, well, I can take some of their arguments and put them in a presuppositional frame and use them.
Yeah, that
But
sounds,
right, yeah,
yeah.
I can do that. But the way they're doing it, I would argue, is bad, because they're appealing to the unbeliever. They're saying, yes, you really are neutral, and yeah, you're a good thinker, and I'm like, no, I'm not going to play that game, because it's not true. It's just not true.
Right,
So
right.
the presuppositional method is truthful. It's truthful from the beginning, but it is a little harder because it requires people to think rationally, and most people don't. And so you have to do a little more build up. You have to say, well, let's talk about what it means to be rational. Rational people have good reasons for what they believe, right? And you kind of
Right.
take them through the steps. So I guess my approach would be, I would rather use a presuppositional argument that is irrefutable, even though it takes a little more work to build up, to educate the person to be able to understand the argument,
Well,
rather
that's
than
another
using
thing,
it.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
rather than using a bad argument and simply capitulate to their ignorance. So
Right, right, yeah.
that's my take on it.
Right, right. Because sometimes it is philosophical, right? The presuppositional approach is philosophical, and sometimes you might need to have a prolonged conversation and maybe sort of talk about some of the ideas behind, what's epistemology, what's something like that, to sort of maybe lay the groundwork. Maybe not all the
Yep.
terms and all the all the technical details, but still,
Sure. Yeah.
I
You don't
guess.
have to use technical jargon. You don't have
Yeah,
to.
yeah. No, yeah. So sometimes I guess it might take a bit longer, whereas the other approach might facilitate a more faster approach to sort of talking about
Quicker
these
and easier,
arguments.
but it's not. Yeah, the classical and evidential are quicker and easier, but they're not really truthful. They're not really consistent with scripture. Whereas the presuppositional approach might take a little longer, but it's devastatingly powerful. There's no refutation against it, and it's truthful from the beginning. I'm not pretending that the unbeliever really is neutral toward God. I'm being honest with them and saying, no, you're really not, and let's talk about this and see why.
Right, right, yeah, yeah, yeah. The no neutrality thing is something else that I've learned, and I think that's really true. Yeah, yeah. Greg Bonson talks about it. I've heard you, I've heard Dr. Anderson. Lots of people talk about, yeah, there's the myth of neutrality, in the sense that, yeah, there's no neutral person. Does not exist. Either your mind is hostile to God and an enmity to him, or you're in subjection to his will, and therefore your desires are in alignment with his, which I think is biblically true. And again, which is the foundation of precept, right? I mean, it starts from the
Yes.
Bible. It's very theocentric. It's very centered on God, as opposed to the anthropocentric ways. In which, again, I'm not saying that they're all bad, but still, it is true. It's the more I think about it, people like you are really right. Now, how I put this into practice, it's really hard for me. So
It takes time.
sometimes,
It takes time.
because it also kind of involves some amount of, I guess, confrontation, and you just think, maybe not. Maybe I'll just sort of stay there and just focus on this and maybe talk about some stuff. But I've seen others, cite and Bruggencate, and maybe others who just who have this. I guess it's also the ability to be able to not fear confrontation. I don't know. It's just strength, and of course belief in God, that you have to speak the word in truth and boldness, and also not just to atheists but also to other religions, which I think is also something that Precept does pretty well. Now, uh, uh, in your discussion with Eli about the presuppositional apologetics, I asked a question, and actually Eli put that out. There are a lot of questions that I typed in, and some of them he did. I got the opportunity to ask most of them right now. I'm so happy. But I did ask one, and maybe you can ask that again right now. I know I've taken way too much of your time. I won't delay this much longer, but maybe a couple more questions. One of that would be, is the Trinitarian argument for predication, which I've heard some people use, is that the best argument that we have against other theistic worldviews? Like, for example, well, maybe not Hinduism, although that's actually larger I am here and something that I need to work on. But is that an argument against? Because some other things like the laws of logic, and maybe this is the way that I'm thinking it is wrong, but still I've heard some people claim that the Trinitarian argument for predication is a good way. The Trinitarian argument for predication is a good approach when we're dealing with Muslims, for example. Is that a reasonable approach, do you think?
I think it's a good one. I don't know if it's the best one, but it's a good one
Right.
because the when you predicate in terms of I assume the way we're talking about it here is in the sense of associating a particular with a universal.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so so Socrates is a human, and so human would be the universal. He's got humanity, he's humanness. That's the universal, which Socrates is one particular. And so when you predicate that, Socrates is and we'd expect that because that exists within the triune God himself. The
Yes.
Son is God, the Father is God, the Spirit is God, but the Spirit is not the Son is not the Father. And so you have one God, one being who is God, three persons who are God. And so it makes sense that we can have things like that in God's creation, that where you can have particulars and universals. And so the problem of the one and the many, I think, is resolved in the Trinitarian worldview. And I don't think it's adequately resolved in any other. So yeah, I think that's good. It's not something I specialize in. It's something that others probably have. I think John Frame is really solid on that, and Greg Boston certainly was.
The triperspectival
But
view, I think. Yeah.
yeah, but I think it's good. I think it's good. And I think probably the best argument for the Trinity, though, would be we have revelation from God, and the Bible reveals God to be triune. That would be the best, is that God has revealed himself to be triune. And I think there are other examples you could use of that. I don't know that all of them would work with a Muslim, but there are Unitarian branches of cults that are Christian, that call themselves Christian,
Yeah,
but they
met
don't
some
believe
of
in the
them.
Trinity.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they don't believe in the Trinity. And I think, I could point out to them, how would that make sense? Because you believe God is love, right? And
Exactly.
love
Yeah.
in the sense of agape, he's a selfless love. Well, wait a minute, but God is also completely self-determined. He doesn't need anything beyond himself. But wait a minute, if God is love and there's only one person, who did God love for all eternity before he made
Exactly.
How can God be love if there's only one? See, in the triune God, the Father loves the Son loves the Father, the Spirit loves the Father and the Son, and so on. And so you can have an agape, a selfless love, an other love, and yet
It
still have one
pre-exists.
being who's three persons. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that. I think there's a lot of ways to defend the Trinity, but the best would be it's the clear revelation of Scripture. The Trinity
Right.
is not something we would come up with. It's not something that we would invent, because it's hard for us. It's hard for us to accept, because there's nothing in nature that's exactly like it. But I do think the Trinity solves the problem of the one and the many, and therefore makes sense of predication.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So love pre-exists creation. It's not that God created human beings and then loved them. It's that the love as itself existed prior to any sort of creation, because
Yes.
the Father completely and truly loved the Son completely and truly loves the Holy Ghost, and all three are in communion with one another. Yeah. So there's fellowship, there's love, there's all sorts of things that pre-exist human creation. Whereas if it's sort of indivisible, monadic, not Trinitarian view of of God, then yeah, those things don't actually, which is actually really really cool.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's so we've actually covered the breadth of a lot of things. I'll just push this all back to one question about evolution, and then maybe ask you to just and the final question would be, how best would you talk about evolution, and why it's actually not viable, and why it's incompatible with Christianity and also with evidence. So just in a simple way for someone to understand. So I'll ask you that as the last question. One before
Okay.
that is, so can you explain this thing? So the hominins, right? So we've got the Australopithecus afarensis, which I think is Lucy, and then the Homo habilis, Homo erectus. So they sort of fit into the evolutionary timeline, and then they claim that the fossils, there's the fossils that show all of these traits, right? So these morphological traits are there. You can see them for yourselves, stuff like that, and so and 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 that there's this overlap. There's this morphological overlap between all of these things. They claim that, right? So, and is that true? And if that is, what on earth are they? I mean, you've got. I thought, well,
Okay.
they don't look like us, right? I mean, whatever Lucy is certainly not. But still, there's overlap. So then, is there an argument for common descent in that fashion? I forgot to ask you this at the beginning. I'm sorry. So I'm just gonna
Okay.
put this here.
It's a good question. I'll try to sum it up real quick here since we're
Right.
almost out of time. I'll have to
Yeah.
log off after your next question. Um, so basically, if you've been told that there's this nice sequence, you've been lied to. It's just not there. We certainly find a lot of primates in the fossil record, and we find 4 varieties of human beings. And when I say varieties, it would be like an ethnicity today, except most ethnicities would be hard to tell just from the skeleton. But there are, in addition to what we call modern Homo sapiens, there are 3 other variations that exist in the fossil record, but they're clearly human. They just have very little differences. Like Neanderthals, for example, those are human beings, but they tended to have larger brow ridges on average than we had. They had larger skulls on average than we had, a larger bone ridge, bone bridge right there. That's the the lower section of your nose cartilage, the upper section's bone. This was larger on Neanderthals. They were a little stockier than most people today, but they had all the characteristics that are typical of human, all of them. For example, our rib cages. Our rib cages are vertical on the sides and then curve up at the top. Apes don't do that. Apes are conical. Apes have a rib cage like this. And you'll find in the fossil record, you'll find the 4 varieties of human beings that have the vertical rib cages and it curves at the top, and you'll find apes that are Christmas tree, like cone
Right.
shaped.
Yeah.
You won't find one morphing into another. Humans, the way our teeth are shaped, they're parabolas, and so the shape of the way the teeth go back is like that. Whereas with an ape, it's a U. They become vertical on the side, kind of like our rib cage. Their teeth are
Right.
that way. There's no transition where there's one going to the other. Apes have enormous molars. We don't. We have relatively small molars. So Lucy had all the characteristics of an ape. She had the rib cage that's like that. The way her hip bones were placed, they're out to the side like that. They're flat. Humans curve like that, and that's designed for upright walking. All apes, they're out to the side. I mean, there's different styles, but they're not curved around like ours are. There was a guy who busted Lucy's hip bone up and then he added plaster to make it curved, but it didn't come that way. That actually happened.
Whoa.
And then,
That sounds
yeah,
ridiculous.
yeah, it's nuts what they'll do. The shape of our knees is different because we're designed for walking upright and so on. Lucy had all the characteristics of an ape. She had the massive molars. She had the rib cage that's shaped like that. The way her phalanges were designed, her fingers were curved. Not all apes have that, but apes that have curved phalanges are climbing apes,
Okay.
apes that live
Yeah.
in trees. So Lucy was a 3-foot tall tree dwelling primate. There's nothing about her that's remotely human, nothing at all. She's 100% primate. And that's what you'll find in the fossil record is you'll find 100% primates, 100% human beings. And this idea, but we find these ones in earlier layers. That's not even true either. If you look at the places where they're found, how deep down they're found, even if you assume for the sake of argument that that's millions of years, there's a lot of overlap. And the book I'd recommend, I've got it back on my shelf back there somewhere. It's by Marvin Lubenow. And he's written a book called I think it's called Bones of Contention, either
Oh
Bone of
yeah,
Contention
bones
or
of contention.
yeah.
Yeah, I've heard
It's a
you claim that.
fantastic
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Talk
and
about yeah.
it'll show you the 4 varieties of human beings that we find in the fossil record, and then all these others that are just primates, and they have all the characteristics of the ape, the rib cage, the pelvis, the way it's displayed. A lot of times the shoulders. If you've ever, when you were a kid, if you would ever hang for a long period of time, your shoulders would hurt because we're not designed for that. But apes
Right.
are. Their shoulders are designed to be able to hang. Lucy's were designed like that. So what you'll find in the fossil record is 100% apes and 100% human beings, and that's all you find. That's the bottom line.
Wow. That's yeah, that's that's really interesting. Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. So yeah, I'll come to the last question, Dr. Lisle. Thank you for spending so much time. It's been really fun. I'll just ask you to summarize on why it is that evolution is incompatible with Christianity. So just to when we talk to Christians around us, and a lot of people like myself, we have this trouble. So should I try and fix the two together? Should I try and find some way to sort of see if there's a theistic evolutionist approach, or just it's just not it's just incompatible. So don't. So maybe can you, from a biblical point of view, maybe can you explain that?
Yep. Yeah. I know it's a temptation for all of us because evolution's popular right now, but you know what? There were a lot of myths that were popular before evolution, and they're gone now. Always trust in God's word, and you won't end up with egg on your face if you deny God's word and try to make it match with the allegedly scientific view of the day, whatever that is. Because there was a time when people thought the planets went around this and the sun went around the Earth. Uh, that's not true. There was a time when people thought the earth was flat. The Bible indicates it's spherical in places like Job 26:10, for
Right.
example.
Yeah.
But there might have been a time when people say, yeah, I know the Bible says the earth's spherical, but our best scientists say it's flat. Well, they were wrong. The
Right.
Bible's right.
Right.
The reasons you don't want to try to meld evolution in the Bible, one, it's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible very clearly teaches God created in 6 days. He made the various organisms according to their kinds. He tells us the various kinds that he made. Jesus and the apostles believed in a literal Genesis. Jesus, for example, when he wanted to explain marriage in Matthew chapter 19, he went back and quoted Genesis 1 and 2 as history. He believed it. And
Right.
he's
Yeah.
God, so he ought to know. So there's no doubt that Jesus and the apostles and all the biblical writers believed that Genesis was real history, that it happened the way God says it did. And then the other big thing you got to remember is all forms of evolution require millions of years of death and suffering before human beings were around to cause death and suffering. And that's a problem because the Bible indicates that human beings are what are responsible for death and suffering in the world. God cursed the earth as a result of Adam's sin, because Adam was given charge over the earth. And so his sin affected everything under his care. And so that means the nephesh kaya, the living animals and human beings now die as a result of Adam's sin. And you say, well, that's not so important. It is important because death being the penalty for sin is the entire reason Jesus had to go to the cross to pay for our
Right.
sins.
Yeah.
If death's not the penalty for sin, then Jesus died in vain. The Son of God died a horrible, excruciating death for no reason if evolution's true. So that's why it's important to believe in biblical creation. And I would argue the science goes along with that as well. So, and if you
Right.
don't mind a shameless plug, my website,
Oh,
Biblical
please.
Science Institute,
Right.
biblicalscienceinstitute.com has a lot of great articles, most of them on the science of this, showing how science lines up with what the Bible teaches.
Also, Dr. Lisle has tons of books, The Ultimate Proof of Creation being one, there's Discerning Truth, and then there's quite a lot of them. I've read two, but there's others as well that really go into the depth of all of these things, presuppositional apologetics, as well as evolution and the Word of God. So, yeah, people can check those out. They're really amazing books. I'd really recommend all of them. Dr. Lisle, it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you for coming and having this chat and spending 2 hours with me and all sorts of things. But it's been really fun. I'm really glad I was able to do this. I had all those questions. I was able to ask all of them today, and I'm really glad that you came over. And thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.